You're listening to a health podcast, which means you probably care about health and you enjoy podcasts. I'm Dan Kendall, the founder of Health Podcast Network, and I want to invite you to join me and thousands of healthcare professionals and leaders at the annual health event taking place in Las Vegas, October 20th to 23rd. When you're there, I'd love to meet you at our exclusive reception on Monday, October 21st. In fact, the host of the show you're about to listen to plans to be there too. Reserve your spot. Visit healthpodcastnetwork.com/health. That's healthpodcastnetwork.com/HLTH and save $250 with our special discount code. Again, that's healthpodcastnetwork.com/HLTH. I look forward to seeing you there.
Hi, I'm Dr. Raj Sundar, a family physician and a community organizer. You're listening to Healthcare for Humans, the show dedicated to educating you on how to care for culturally diverse communities so you can be a better healer. This is about everything that you wish you knew to really care for the person in front of you, not just a body system. Let's learn together. All right, everyone. Welcome to our 4-part series on the Ukrainian community. Today, we'll be talking about mental health. I feel like for every community, this is an important topic to talk about. But for the Ukrainian community, it seems even more important. Because the landscape of mental health is shaped by a complex history of stigma, rooted in the Soviet era when psychiatry was wielded as a tool of repression. Meaning mental health was used as an excuse to isolate, jail, and harm people. This has been slowly changing, but now the stigma around mental health has been compounded by the ongoing war and the trauma of the refugee experience. For many in the Ukrainian community, they're navigating foreign schools and healthcare systems while separated from loved ones, all under the weight of prolonged grief. The grief is prolonged because there's no end in sight of when they can go back to their homeland, because for many, that is still the ultimate goal, this longing and yearning to return to Ukraine and achieve self-determination. To understand the complexity of the mental health struggles of the Ukrainian community, Olga, a warmline navigator within the Ukrainian Refugee Health Program, and Tamara, who you heard from in Part 1 and Part 2, the co-founder and director of Nashi Immigrants Health Board, will share their insights on what the resettlement process has looked like for the Ukrainian community and the community's incredible resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. Despite all this, the community has maintained a strong sense of identity and found solace in peer support. I think that's worth calling out because when we talk about mental health, we focus on professionalization of care, whether that's therapists, psychiatrists, something with the healthcare system. But for the Ukrainian community, what's been really effective has been peer support, connecting with people who've also been through the same thing you have. This specific kind of support is relatable and approachable, especially in the context of distrust. And on top of that, it offers something called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is when people find meaning through service and mutual support, even amidst the darkness of trauma. With the ongoing fight for self-determination for the Ukrainian community, peer support is what's sustaining them. We'll talk about this specific model and additional inspiring ways how this community has come together to heal. Here's Olga and Tamara. Welcome to the show, Olga and Tamara. I'm excited to have you here. We did have an episode with Tamara, and we talked about some of the bigger issues that contributed to the current health of the Ukrainian community. Mental health was such an important piece of that. I know you've done so much community work around it. Let's first start talking about the context of the current state of mental health of the Ukrainian community, because I think part of that is how is mental health perceived in the community. From what I've read, a lot of it is clouded because of the use of psychiatry as a tool of repression in the Soviet era. And that has made people really skeptical about mental health overall because of their memories of what this looks like. Could you tell me a little bit more about, when I say mental health, what does the Ukrainian community think of? And what is the reason for that?
Things really changed since 2014 when Russia first invaded the eastern parts of Ukraine. We had a lot of internal refugees in Ukraine, and psychologists started really working with people with war trauma. So I would say that level of trust has increased since 2014. Ukraine has a lot of Soviet heritage, And during the Soviet time, looking for mental health care was stigmatized. And those who are looking for mental health care, they may be mentally ill or just a sign of weakness. And it's still there, especially among people of older generation and among men. Like there is a belief in Ukraine, men should be strong, boys don't cry. And it makes it very difficult, especially for veterans of war. They had to be strong and show their masculinity during the battlefield. At the same time, we have a lot of psychologists who work at the battlefield or capellans. I would say that, yes, mental health care is still more stigmatized in Ukraine than it is here in the US. At the same time, the level of trust increased since 2014.
That's a good way to encompass it. Is there a different word to use? I also heard that saying mental health or depression and anxiety automatically makes people think, no, that's not me, because people who were called mentally ill were often hospitalized outside of their wills.
With the refugees, we use the word peer support. The level of peer support, of actual support that peers can provide, that's amazing, because we see people coming to our peer support groups or calling us, and they're often desperate and they feel trapped with all the difficulties they face here in the environment. It's amazing to see how they open their hearts and mind to other peers and the counselor. We prefer to use the word peer supported. It seems to be more appropriate to our community.
That's great. That's a great way to encompass it, because you can still get to the conversation of what's hard without getting people to feel hesitant about talking to somebody about their mental health. Calling it peer support, because people understand what that means, especially for communities who've experienced community traumas. I think of the children who've experienced this too, both who have had to flee Ukraine and people who've lost their parents. What does mental health look like for them right now?
I would say it really depends on their experiences. But for now, I would say that all who were present in Ukraine when the full-scale invasion started, all those people have more or less of war trauma and PTSD. Some people lost their houses or friends or family members, while others just saw explosions or had to hide in the bomb shelters. All of them have trauma. I remember one mom, she came to our welcome center for Ukrainians with her teenage daughter. Then it was just some very loud sound on the street. Nobody noticed it. But the teenage girl, she was completely scared and she immediately fall on the floor. So it was her reaction. So many kids have trauma. At the same time, if the parents are confident about their presence and future, it helps children to be more calm. Talking about school-aged kids and teenagers, we hear from many parents that educational system in America and in Ukraine are very different. Many parents told us that the level of education in Ukraine is higher. At the same time, the level of psycho-emotional support and emotional intelligence in American schools is higher than in Ukraine. In America, teachers and tutors just pay more attention for forming self-confidence and soft skills. And it's a little confusing for parents. For example, in Ukraine, we are used to having large textbooks for each subject in school. And then parents called us like, oh, my kid went to the school and he came back or she came back without textbook. What does it mean? We also heard about some cases of bullying at school, and I don't know how much it related to being a refugee, to being a Ukrainian, or it's just teenager thing.
I also wanted to add, because I know that you mentioned people who've lost loved ones. I also think that in our groups and on our warm line, the resettlement process is super traumatic. And having some of the examples that Olga was stating about going to a new school system, the healthcare system. So all of these areas of life are very different. And also there are people here, moms and children without their spouse. Parents might be back in Ukraine. The loss of the connection that is close, being so far away.
Thank you. Is there something unique to the Ukrainian community that affects how their resettlement process feels like compared to other refugees? I think of all refugees exhibits difficulty coming to the United States, and each community has specifics on what makes it difficult for them in this unique way. What does that mean for the Ukrainian community outside of showing up to a new country, not knowing anybody, no language, and lack of support just in resettlement in the US?
I would say that what makes Ukrainian refugee community unique and at the same time helps Ukrainians adjust to the new reality is that people are open-minded, friendly, and communicative. Even without language, they can receive peer support just among friends, especially if we are talking about women. It's very common just to share problems, thoughts, and challenges, and to receive advice, ideas, or just support. I know that many newcomers start visiting churches and find some support there. But it's very difficult for the families, as Tamara mentioned. Many families are separated. Husbands, fathers, they can be still in Ukraine, maybe fighting at the battlefield, and moms arrive here with the kids, and it puts additional emotional burden on them.
I had two thoughts along what you were talking about. One was what I noticed is that resilience is really present. If you provide resources for someone, they usually will run with those. For example, you can give them something and they will make their best effort to figure that out and not wanting to burden you with more details around a specific resource, which speaks to the resilience of being able to figure it out, wanting to figure it out, wanting to know how to do something. I'm on a Facebook Messenger group with some Ukrainians from the community. The other day, someone reported that a loved one from their town was lost. The chain of messages was everyone reporting that they had lost a loved one from a neighboring town. This was people who have resettled here right now who are experiencing this with family, friends, schoolmates. And it hit me that the message was continuing with different people commenting. That was what their experience was.
Yeah, the trauma is ongoing. Sometimes I feel like I talk about it like it's in the past, but it's still happening in the loss of loved ones. How do you keep processing when there's no clear end, when things will feel safer for your family? Another piece of the difficulty that I sense talking to the Ukrainian community is this continual need for self-determination. Because of the confusion with the Russian community, people's mental health of this is who I am. And I think it's a source of resilience, but that it's sometimes difficult. I think, Tamara, we talked about this when flyers are in Russian and you're trying to communicate to the entire community. If people feel like, no, I'm Ukrainian. So this continuing exposure to this feeling of I'm my own person, we are our own community, and not hearing that over and over can be a source of distress too.
Yeah, that's true. Historically, Ukrainian and Russian languages, they're very similar. It's the same language group, and we can easily understand each other. Many Ukrainians used to speak Russian. I am from the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. I used to speak Russian with my friends, with my family. I deliberately changed it in 2014, but many people, especially close to the Russian border on the east parts of Ukraine or southern parts of Ukraine, might even still speak Russian with their family members, but on public, they would like to emphasize the Ukrainians and they switch to Ukrainian. I used to hear the language doesn't matter if you share the same ideas, but now people realize that language really matters, and more Ukrainians switch to Ukrainian, and they don't feel comfortable not just with the language, but with the Soviet heritage. I remember we had a Christmas celebration for Ukrainian refugees in our welcome center. And somebody started playing Soviet cartoon song. And few people came to us and they asked us to ask those person to stop because they don't want to have anything to do in common with the Soviet heritage. At the same time, yes, it's still among American society associating Ukrainians with Russia, with the Soviet Union. Of course, it's much less now with all ongoing news. But sometimes when I speak to Americans, I can hear from them, "Are you Russian? You have Russian accent." And I personally don't have word trauma, but I don't like hearing it. And I can only imagine how traumatic it might be for those who have PTSD, for example.
I would also add, because you remember this from speaking with you in the past, my family came over as refugees after World War II. Because of their experience, they wanted us to know Ukrainian because it was being taken away from them. That was the biggest priority for my family, teaching us this language. That was cemented in me. I understand how people feel in terms of how my family felt being called Russian. Back in those times, there was the Soviet Union and no distinction. So the only distinction they had was their history and their language. That was how I was raised. Seeing this, it's really interesting to connect with people in our community and see that, as Olga said, people wanting to make that distinction of who they are, their identity. Which region you're from in Ukraine may speak to which language you were brought up with. If you have kids and you're speaking Russian because that was common in your area, trying to retrain in another language can be a barrier, even if you feel that identity. So what I've seen as well as what Olga said is that people are really proud of the identity and they want that to be known.
To summarize the trauma you're experiencing or the community is experiencing in Ukraine being a big sort of cause for the mental health distress. Second being this identity of how do you hold on to the identity, especially in the midst of conflict and you're moving. Third is this resettlement process itself, feeling isolated, causing loneliness. This all leads to anxiety, depression, loneliness. I would love to hear more from you all. Substance use, drinking, etc. How that's perceived in the community, how that's become the coping mechanism. The second being prolonged grief disorder, which I haven't heard much about, but that was called out in one of the articles. That specifically being something currently experienced in the Ukrainian community.
I remember when I was in Ukraine after 2014 and I was working with soldiers of war with their wives. Yes, many of them admitted that when men came back from war, they had drug and alcohol issues. From my experience in Ukraine, there were a lot of programs for veterans of war involving peer support and helping the veterans find their new place in peaceful life that helped to deal with those issues. To talk about prolonged grief, yes, it's still here and we hear a lot about it from people who call to the warm line. At the same time, we try to teach them post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth itself, I believe, exists. There are many examples like showing that it exists. But it's just step-by-step process. It's not like a shiny, clear, and nice process. Sometimes it's a dirty and dusty process. Sometimes you take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But it's important to move in the right direction. And we are here to help people to do it when they fall. Will stand up and continue moving in the right direction.
I've heard people mention relational issues between a couple, even some of the areas that we've been trying to support our community with, issues with domestic violence. And it's more informal, as Olga said. We aren't having calls for people saying they need help with stopping drinking alcohol, but it's mentioned in ways that revolve around some of these activities and relational issues. The past of family having that history of having alcohol as a coping mechanism and alcoholism in the family. But speaking to the prolonged grief and the topic we just spoke about in the last question, Ukrainian people are daily seeing the news reports of their country not having an outcome of what is going to happen to it in terms of prolonged grief and trauma. I think that's contributing to it, because if you've left trying to be safe, knowing the next steps may decrease your anxiety and stress levels, hearing from family, doing your Zoom calls and seeing the news, there is no outcome for people to have a solid idea of what their life is going to look like. This is what will happen next year. So I think in terms of the prolonged grief, until there may be some type of resolution, either for the person with the post-traumatic growth that they may go through or with the outcome for Ukraine as a country, the grief will be prolonged.
Yeah, I would like to add that we had one woman who used to call us over and over again for psycho-emotional support to the warm line. And she was a woman of older generation. She shared with us that her main dream is just to come back to Ukraine, and Ukraine is her home. She is here temporary. One day she called us and said, I have no place to come back anymore. My village is completely destroyed. Of course, she and other people, they have feeling of loss, as Tamara said, of loss their future perspective and presence as well.
Yeah, that loss of hope is difficult to hear, can manifest in different ways. But this idea of I'm going back to the place where I came after this is over, whenever that is, I can imagine that's hard to process. This is all important because when we box people into diagnosis, which happens in our system pretty quickly, it doesn't address the underlying cause of finding meaning and hope of something that's happening actively in the community as a whole. I'm curious on this one part that you said of post-traumatic growth that we've been speaking to. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
I personally, of course, can only guess about what some people are going through. Sometimes the burden of their loss or trauma is too heavy. When we work with refugees, we suggest activities to get involved, to have the feeling of belonging. It's very important for Ukrainians as well. And right now I'm thinking about the lady in her 70s. She attends our peer support groups weekly, and she is very enthusiastic. Her language skills are not perfect, but she keeps talking English using gestures, using Google Translator, whatever. She's full of enthusiasm, even though she's from the area that also suffered from the war. People can be a source of healing for other people. And it can be through peer support, working with professional psychologists, being with family members or with those who you trust.
I agree with all of what you said. We were very fortunate to be trained through a program in the United States that worked with veterans on building post-traumatic growth. The distinction we learned in our training is that you can be experiencing PTSD and have a clinical diagnosis, and in parallel, you can experience PTG. You can have growth happening even at the time that you're having the traumatic experiences, which was part of that hopefulness and a lot of the examples that Olga gave around people coming to the community. What I see as a big example, and I know in the training they gave us, they defined areas for people to have tools that we now use with our programs. One area was service, meaning that if you engage yourself into something that is kind of that energy that you're having that may be having you to experience that trauma, if you put it towards a service area that is meaningful to you, which, for example, for our Ukrainian community is coming to the peer group and supporting other people, volunteering. On our Nashi team, many of our team members are part of the refugee resettlement from the full-scale invasion. So for them, the growth is experienced through supporting others through the process of trauma to make it just a little bit easier and a little bit more supportive in that place. And that's what I've seen with a lot of our groups, our team, and a lot of our areas of outreach.
That adds a lot of nuance to it. That makes sense to me. Of it's happening simultaneously, but there's places where you can connect and feel like the energy that you're using is helping you cope, become resilient, and maybe even grow in this painful, distressing situation that you're constantly seeing or connecting with people in Ukraine. Olga, I know you talked to many of the other people with the questions we had developed. We talked about the stigma and how that's changed since 2014. Now that we've talked about some of the topics the entire community is facing, what kind of stigma still exists, or what else did the community bring up that we haven't talked about yet?
What we hear from our refugees, that some of them still really want to go home, and not just people of older generation, but young people. They say, when it's over, we will go home. We want to go home. I believe that this experience of staying in the US will be incredibly contributing to those who will come back and rebuild Ukraine. I personally remember when I arrived to the US, my first huge impression was how Americans treat people with disabilities, both mental and physical. And that's incredible, really. You in America, the American society, make people with disabilities feel just part of the society, equal. Now, when we have people who lost their limbs, developed some disabilities with the war, it's incredibly important for those who come back to know and teach others how to treat such people, how to build a welcoming society for such people. So I would say that, yes, among Ukrainians, we might have different attitude to people with disabilities or understanding of what mental health care is. But staying here in the US, it teaches people. I believe they will contribute to American society as well, because many Ukrainians are very skilled and talented people.
That's great.
I love that response. I lived in Ukraine for a bit when I was doing some nursing research. One of my research points was to look at how the landscape was set up for people with physical disabilities. And I did find that it was really hard to get around. If you were disabled with a wheelchair or had any mobility issues, we've worked with a number of families who've had a child diagnosed with autism. So trying to do that psychoeducation and sharing information around what that sounds like, what that looks like, and what happens here in the United States around someone who has that diagnosis in terms of early intervention and how that can be nurtured and fostered. But also in terms of the stigma of mental illness, I think there's a difference in the community's understanding of some anxiety or depression around a traumatic event versus mental illness as someone who has bipolar disorder, manic depressive, or a schizophrenic. I haven't seen a lot of psychoeducation around that type of thing, although I've heard some community members who've said that there are family members they know who are resisting treatment because they don't understand exactly what the disorder is or does to the mind or brain.
Yeah, that's definitely true. If you're not getting the right mental health support, if you have schizophrenia, hallucinations, and bipolar, people's processing of what's happening makes sense to a degree, although it's stigmatizing. Or to your point of when you give people with disabilities the right resources and treat them kindly and appropriately, what does that look like? And how do you treat people differently when you know it's possible? It's a good way to transition to talk about the next steps now that we understand the stigma. I want to hear a little bit more about the warm line. 2 is the peer support. Part of the peer support is I've heard about people building community-based groups with cultural activities. So what does that look like? Cooking together, praying, singing. What does it feel like to really have something that's helping communities heal?
Along with my coworker, I work as a warm line navigator. The warm line is a confidential place where people can call with their informational or psycho-emotional requests. When people arrive here, they face so many differences and difficulties, and they often do not understand how this or that process should go on. And if they don't know English, it makes it even more difficult. They can call us with whatever question they might have during the resettlement process, like questions of medical insurance or rental assistance or public transportation assistance, English as second language classes. We try to find those resources for them and either refer them or help them in some other way. Sometimes people call us just for peer support when they feel lost or overwhelmed. I am proud to say that many people call us over and over, which means we build trusting relationships with them. We try to involve people of different generation in our peer support activities. Like when we have workshops, we often have workshops for parents with the little kids, and presenter is talking about the topic of workshop. At the same time, we have activities and presents and gifts for the little kids. So family can go all together, people of all generation can go and find some peer support or valuable resources.
Yeah, that is true for all the different groups. Peer support was an idea in the program that evolved organically. For example, we have a group that evolved into older adults. Maybe they have a time during the day. It's mostly women, some men come, but they all have become close friends. And I think coming gives them that, oh, a friend of mine is waiting, wants to see me. Sometimes we'll have them text the friend if they didn't show up. And that's this community support system, and they want to catch up with each other. So that's been really positive. We've had some areas of outreach around plants and growing flowers. A lot of these older adults had gardens in Ukraine and are very proud of the things that they grew. Seeing them here is really exciting. We've done some field trips for people to be out in nature and see those gardens. That's been really successful. As Olga was saying, for the parents with kids, we try to do more of a health education aspect where they can learn something about our healthcare system. They can bring their kids. So everyone has a function at the event and can do some learning. The children have things to do and play with. In those cases, you'll have a group of moms. For example, our last one was over-the-counter medication safety. A pharmacy in the U.S. has multiple items of the same medication with different names and different dosages, and was around how that is very overwhelming. So the moms in a small setting get to ask these specific questions that they wouldn't feel safe in a bigger group. I thought that this was that, but you taught me that I should do it this way. And then they can share information around the primary care person that they see. Oh, I saw this specialist and they spoke Ukrainian. And so they share information with each other. The peer support really takes off that way. We also have a big group of people that are very excited to learn English in a safe space. All of the people in the group, including the peer counselor, are Ukrainian, so they can make mistakes together and talk about how scary it is and not wanting to be on the spot in class to have to speak English. And that's been really successful because people are really motivated with each other, but they're also feeling like, oh, you're going through this as well. This is super hard, but we're going to keep going at it together. So that's been really positive. There are also other examples which aren't specifically formal to our peer support, but we have a colleague and friend who started a folk group. The folk group sings Ukrainian folk songs. A lot of them have history around some of the folklore in Ukrainian history. They are able to get together as a group, let off stress, and sing beautifully. Now they've taken to performing locally, going to different festivals. They are a tight-knit group of people who find their stress relief in singing these folk songs and promoting this and getting other people excited for it. So I think that's another kind of example of peer support that we see, which is nice. And we also have an LGBTQ plus group where we have a counselor available who can talk with people and has a separate Facebook page and an email to be able to have people contact them so they can feel comfortable and safe talking and meet others that are going through this transition from Ukraine to the United States.
That's so interesting to me and beautiful to hear. When we say it's a peer support group, sometimes we focus on just Ukrainian peer support group, like somehow being Ukrainian means that's all your identity is, because we focused on that so much. But Ukrainian community is just like every other community where we have different. So when we talk about peer support, the nuances and specificity of these smaller groups and how the power is in that, not just talking about Ukraine and the trauma we've been through, but the specific over-the-counter medication I need to give to my kid. Thanks for being in this support with me so I can figure that out. The last piece that I thought was interesting, when we were talking about mental health in the Latino community, the peer support group isn't come learn about anxiety, come learn about post-traumatic growth. People aren't going to sign up for that. They're not going to say, yes, okay, I'll be there at 12 o'clock to eat food and talk about post-traumatic growth. But it's come hang out with us, right? We're just here to hang out and talk about what's important to us. That's the first step. Once there's trust, maybe we'll talk about something more. Maybe not. Some groups never do, but maybe it comes out. And then maybe there's enough trust built for somebody to take that first step of talking to a stranger about something personal, having peers say, this is okay, and validating that this is okay to do a therapy session specifically about trauma.
Example that I thought of when you were talking and summarizing was the example of the system difference in the mental health care, which one of our clients was having in distress and trying to find support. And there was a local organization that was building a program to support a Ukrainian. They wanted to start a psychotherapy session or have someone to talk to. So they knew that there would need to be interpretation. So that will take another step. But when they called, the operator said, we'll be speaking with you and get you a consultation. But first you have to fill out these forms, depression scale, anxiety scale first, so that we know where you're at and have this information before we can work with you. And the person said, I just really wanted to talk, but they created a barrier by giving me these forms, which I didn't really know what to do with and how to fill them out because the questions didn't make sense to me. And then it seemed ironic that I called a helpline that said, call here for a consultation.
Yeah, that's a great thing to call out. In our healthcare system, it's nice to have a specific number on how depressed you are so that we know if it's getting better or not, right? We need a number to it. There's a lot of pieces to that. When people are looking for a connection and compassion, and that whole process does. One of our other guests with the Pacific Islander community called it therapeutic violence. We think it's therapeutic, but it's actually violent of like, we make you fill out questionnaires over and over. You're just thinking about your own trauma because we're just gathering information. When people are like just wanting to talk, to process together rather than doing this over and over. Any other pieces of improving people's mental health other than peer support groups, Warm Line? I've heard that Eastern Orthodox Christianity being a huge, important part of people's lives, but sometimes that religion can be a healing factor.
Yes, I would say that most Ukrainians are Orthodox, if you're talking about Christian people. At the same time, people who come here, if they're Christians, would rather go to Protestant or Baptist church. Religious beliefs might be a barrier to receiving care. When we deal with people, I believe that people who come to us, who call us, they're people who are already open-minded to receiving peer support or psycho-emotional support. I personally never faced any barriers because of people's cultural background or religious beliefs.
I've been working with the Ukrainian community longer. In the 90s, there was an influx of refugees and immigrants due to religious persecution from the Soviet Union. They wanted to practice their religion here freely, and they weren't able to do that. A lot of those folks have large faith-based communities here in Washington that are Pentecostal Christianity, Baptist people who have big communities and support Ukrainian people and some new arrivals who participate in that faith-based group as well. And as Olga said, there may be some differences in their perspective on therapeutic modalities. We may suggest people try, but if you are working with someone who needs support, you're not going to be categorizing them in all these ways and listing all of their different religious background. You want to try to meet them where they are. Can explain to someone that meditation can be the prayer that they use anyway. So we try to meet people where they are and connecting to what is working for them and how we can uplift and support that if they are open to it.
I would also add, talking about mental health, that in many ways how American society functions might be healing for people. For example, when Tamara talked about kids with disabilities, mental or physical disabilities, I personally, as a journalist, interviewed a few moms with autism back in Ukraine. Their situations and circumstances were very different, but there was one common thing among all those moms. They all felt huge shame because their kids' disability. And it's still there in Ukraine. If your kid experiences physical, mental, especially severe disabilities, it's parents' guilt. Like they're guilty. It's because they did something wrong. And it pushes such huge burden on parents' shoulders. And here in the US, once mom of the boy with disability came to our peer support classes, her boy has severe disability. He uses wheelchair and he also has mental disability. And we helped this mom just to go through the paper process to receive help from the state. I talked to her a few times, and every time she received support, it helped her accept her situation. Even her smile changed. She relaxed so much. I believe the way American society treats people with mental disabilities is healing.
That's wonderful.
The only things that we are continuing to develop to support our community are along the lines of how to support families with domestic violence, if that's an issue within their families, which we have heard some of those feedback. And that may be something where in Ukraine, there's a different perspective than here, and trying to lend support. So we're still in the place of gathering data and information to create resources that would be helpful and support people if they're going through that and find appropriate resources for them.
I find that's one of the hardest conversations, not just because of interpartner violence, but challenging beliefs of own countries. There's a conversation of challenging communities' beliefs, whether that's about mental health and disabilities, Olga, that you brought about, of no, this is how we do it in the US, and hopefully this helps everybody. So when you return to Ukraine, maybe you'll think of mental health and disabilities differently. But also for domestic violence, where sometimes it's normalized, when sometimes the power differential between men and women in certain countries that we don't talk about. Here in America, it's saying, no, it's not okay. That is not okay to do, no matter what the history is. I find that can be really hard. I know you're still working on it, but how do you bring up topics like that?
Personally, as a Wormline navigator, I never received a call from a woman who experienced domestic violence, but I have experience talking to such women. Once we talked to Tamara and decided to prepare an article for our Ukrainian community about domestic violence, because many people in Ukraine believe that just physical abuse is domestic violence. So we explained that not just physical abuse, but emotional or financial abuse, sexual abuse is domestic violence. I didn't try to lecture people, but we just gave them sources. If you experience this, you can go there, you can receive help there. Statistically, it takes from 6 to 7 attempts to leave the abuser. So we try to explain to the relatives or friends of those who experience domestic violence that it's worth to try to help and talk to those people over and over, even if they seem to be trapped with the abuser. Just let them know that you're here to help when they feel ready to accept your help.
That's great. Important and hard work too. So thanks for doing it. The last question is, have you personally gotten care here in our healthcare system for mental health? Do you have a family member or a friend who's gotten it, who's had a great experience? And what made it such a good experience for them?
I personally have a lot of experience with Ukrainian psychologists, and I believe I read a lot of books and articles of American psychologists on PTSD growth, post-traumatic growth, and other related topics. I would say that approach that I met among Ukrainian psychologists and American psychologists are pretty much the same. I remember I interviewed few Ukrainian and American psychologists on how to help your child deal with war trauma. The level of expertise, the pieces of advice, they're pretty much the same. In my experience, it depended rather on personality than on the healthcare system. Thankfully, to Tamara, I had this training on post-traumatic growth, and it was incredible. Always give hope, and they always, as Tamara said, we try to meet person where they are and just to work from where they are to give them this hope, to give them not just hope, but better feeling in their presence. and it will affect their future, of course, as well.
Thank you. Beautiful. And great way to end about giving hope as a takeaway message. I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people. Thank you again. As always, thank you for listening to Healthcare for Humans. If you've found any value in this podcast, I have 2 quick requests. 1, please leave a review in the podcast app that you're listening to my voice in right now. It really helps others discover the show. 2, share this episode with anyone who you think might benefit from it. For easy access to all our episodes and to support the podcast, visit www.healthcareforhumans.org. There you'll find our content clearly organized by topics, countries, themes, to help you choose what to listen to next. Until next time, this is Dr. Raj Sundar, reminding you that culturally responsive care leads to better patient outcomes. See you again soon.